Hello, and thank you for visiting A Tent for the Sun. I hope you're having a good day today. Today, we're going to look at one of the best things that God ever gave to us in Christ. And I'm not going to talk about salvation, that's pretty great, and justification, that's pretty great too. But today, we're going to talk about a heart of submission. A heart of submission. That's right. Submission is one of the best things that God ever gave to his people, giving them a heart, a willingness to submit. And there's so much good that's in this gift, a heart of submission, that I'll probably have to make a couple videos about it. But let's get started and let's see the goodness of submission. Now, there's a couple of words most often used as submit in the New Testament. These are taken from Strong's Concordance. And we see the first one here. It means to subordinate, to be under obedience, to be subject to. And a second word here that's used, it means to yield or to surrender, to submit oneself. And so they pretty much mean the same thing, right? The idea is that a person places himself under the authority of another person or organization, whatever it may be, willingly and joyfully trusting the Lord so that they obey the person that they're under. It's a very simple concept. And so I want to look at three reasons today on why a heart of submission is one of the best things God ever gave us. The first reason is this, that Christ himself had a heart of submission to the Father. He only came to do the will of his Father in heaven. And so in John 6:38 he says, "For I have come down from heaven not to do my own will, but the will of him who sent me." See, he there is submitting to the Father. He also submitted to every earthly authority as well. Jesus said in John 4, verse 34, "My food is to do the will of him who sent me and to accomplish his work." And there we see again his submission to the Father. So if Christ only came to do the will of his Father, and we are to be like Christ, then it should be our desire to only do the will of our Father in heaven, right? If we're going to be like Christ, we want to do the will of our Father. And in this area, the Bible's clear. Scriptures are clear. Our Father in heaven wants us to submit to every earthly authority. Second, God the Father is molding us into the image of Christ. This is his purpose from the beginning. Before he said, "Let there be light," his purpose was to mold his people into the image of Christ. We see this in Romans 8, verse 29. "For those whom he foreknew," and that word foreknew means to know intimately, "he also predestined," and that word simply means predetermined, "to be conformed to the image of his Son, in order that he might be the firstborn among many brothers." And so that means that it was the Father's plan from the beginning to change our beliefs, to change our thoughts, to change our words, our attitudes, and our actions to be more and more like Jesus Christ. That's what it means to be molded into his image. And since Jesus had a heart of submission, it's impossible, it's impossible that this is not a prime objective for our Father in heaven, to give us a heart of submission. And we see this in Philippians chapter 2, where we're told to have the same mind as Christ. If there's any encouragement in Christ, any comfort from love, any participation in the Spirit, any affection and sympathy, complete my joy by being of the same mind, having the same love, being in full accord and of one mind. Do nothing from selfish ambition or conceit, but in humility count others more significant than yourselves. You see, we're placing ourselves under others. Let each of you look not only to his own interests, but also to the interests of others. Have this mind among yourselves, which is yours in Christ Jesus, who through him, who though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but he emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, and that word means slave, being born in the likeness of men. This is the attitude that our Father wants to have. Wants us to have a heart of submission. Since Christ had a heart of submission, it's impossible that he would not want us to have the same heart. So to whatever extent we're failing to submit to the authorities that God has placed over us, We are opposing the work of God in us. It's that simple. Can I say that again? To the extent that we're failing to submit to the authorities that God placed over us, we are opposing the work of God in us. It's that simple. I'll demonstrate this in another video, but we are to be a submissive people. Christians are to be a submissive people in every single area of life. And when we look at that, we're going to see that having a heart of submission leads to joy. But that's another video. The third thing we want to look at is that it is the Lord's will that we submit to in every single area of life. Let's start with children. Children are called to submit to their parents. The word submit now is not in this text in Ephesians 6:1, but children are called to obey their parents, which means the same thing. They're putting themselves willingly under the authority of their parents. Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and mother, for this is the first commandment with a promise, that it may go well with you and that you may live long in the land. Similarly, husbands are called to submit to Christ in loving their wives by following the example that Christ gave to the church in his loving the church. Ephesians 5 verse 25, husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. We are to submit to the example of Christ, the teaching of Christ, and the command of Christ here to love our wives. So husbands, we need to submit too. Christians are called to submit to earthly authorities. We see this in 1 Peter 2. Servants, be subject to your masters with all respect, not only to the good and gentle, but also to the unjust. For this is a gracious thing. When mindful of God, one endures sorrows while suffering unjustly. For what credit is it if when you sin and are beaten for it, you endure? But if when you do good and suffer for it, you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you might follow in his steps. Do you see that? We're called to submit to our earthly masters just as he did. He committed no sin, neither was deceit found in his mouth. When he was reviled, or when he was hated, he did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he continued entrusting himself to him who judges justly. That's our calling, to submit to our earthly masters. Again in Ephesians 6 verse 5, bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart, as you would Christ, not only by way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart. You see the will of our Father? It's to submit to our earthly masters, rendering service with goodwill as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. We see also that we're called to submit to our ruling authorities, whether they be Christian or not. And that means our government. In Romans 13, this couldn't be clearer. Let every person be subject to the governing authorities. That means submit to them. For there is no earthly authority except from God. And watch this closely. And those that exist have been instituted by God. Therefore, whoever resists authorities resists what God has appointed. And that's not only true with regards to governments, but that's true in every area of life. As I mentioned earlier, when we don't submit, we're opposing the ordinance of God. And those who will resist will incur judgment. Peter said this too in 1 Peter 2, be subject for the Lord's sake to every human institution, whether it be to the emperor as supreme, that should change our perspective, right? Or to governors as sent by him to punish those who do evil and to praise those who do good. So we are to submit to our governing authorities. The church is also called to submit to Christ. And we saw this back in Ephesians 5. Now, as the church submits to Christ, you see, it's understood, it's assumed. So also wives should submit in everything to their husbands. The church is called to submit to one another in Ephesians 5:21, submitting to one another out of reverence for Christ. It's love for God that causes us to submit. 1 Corinthians 16, now I urge you, brothers, that you know that the household of Stephanas were the first converts in Achaia, and that they have devoted themselves to the service of the saints. Be subject to such as these. You see that? Submit. Submit to such as these, and to every fellow worker and laborer. Women are called in the church, when the church assembles, to learn in submission. 1 Timothy 2, let a woman learn quietly with all submissiveness. Could that be any clearer? And I do not permit a woman to teach or exercise authority over a man. Rather, she is to remain quiet. Just an example there. And here's another example. In the church is called to submit to elders. The elders that God placed over the church. Hebrews 13, verse 17. Obey your leaders and submit to them, for they are keeping watch over your souls, as those who will have to give an account. You see, elders are going to have to give an account for their submission to Christ. Are they obeying Christ in leading the church? But he continues, let them do this. Let the elders serve you with joy and not grief, not groaning, for that would be no advantage to you. And that's also translated, it would be unprofitable for you. So it's unprofitable for me not to submit to the pastor that God put over me. We see also that elders now are to submit to Christ. Peter wrote, so I exhort the elders among you, as a fellow elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, as well as a partaker in the glory that is going to be revealed. Shepherd the flock of God that is among you, exercising oversight, not under compulsion, but willingly, as God would have you. You see, as God would have you. Elders are to submit as leaders over the church in the fashion that God would have them do that, and that's only found in His Word. Not for shameful gain, but eagerly. Not domineering over those in your charge, but being examples to the flock. This is what elders are called to do. And they must submit as well to Christ. And so let's conclude this now. Listen carefully. Listen very carefully and make no mistake about this. When we don't submit to the earthly authorities God gave us from the heart, we are not submitting to Christ. Plain and simple. We are not submitting to Christ. Now, we should meditate long on that truth, and I hope to have another video on this that discusses the joy of submission. That submission to Christ leads to joy, not only to you, not only to me when we submit, but also to those around us. It's a wonderful principle and one that will bless us richly in Christ. Thank you very much for visiting A Tent for the Sun, and I hope that you have a great day today.